Okay, we are back with chapter 3, and so the other example of equivocation is on page 27, where it says, "Found what?" said the duck. "Found it," said the mouse, rather crossly. Of course you know what it means. "I know what it means well enough when I find a thing," said the duck. "It's generally a frog or a worm. The question is, what did the archbishop find?" From the story that the mouse was telling. And so that's another example of equivocation there. We also learned about a little word switch with tail and tail on pages 30 to 31 when the mouse is talking about his tail and that he has a long and sad tail. We also see circular logic on page 28 in chapter 3. This is almost like belaboring the point, or when we see circular logic, it just ends up being nonsense because it's not based on anything that's real. So on page 28, the example is this. "There was no 1, 2, 3, and away." This is describing the caucus race that they had to run. "But they began running when they liked and left off when they liked, so that it was not easy to know when the race was over. However, when they had been running half an hour or so and they were quite dry again, the dodo suddenly called out, 'The race is over!' And they all crowded around it, panting and asking, 'But who has won?'" And so there's just this nonsense race that they're running, and they're going around in circles. And this is how the conversation in Wonderland goes. They just kind of go around in circles and people contribute what they like, and none of it really makes any sense. And that's why it's so fun to read and to watch in movies. And so on page 29, the dodo decides, you know what? Everybody has won, and so we all must have prizes. Of course, they look to Alice to disperse the prizes, so I'll leave that for you if you haven't read that yet. Chapter 4. So, Alice, being mistaken for the White Rabbit's handmaid, reminds us of her status. She doesn't like the fact that the White Rabbit is giving her chores to do, right? She feels like this is beneath her. She's not going to be the servant to a rabbit. And I just really couldn't resist this. This was just too good because you know that we're using Alice in Wonderland as our segue from fairy tales to picture books into middle grade literature, and also what could be considered YA lit, which is young adult lit. And so what we see here on page 38 is she says, "I wonder what can have happened to me. When I used to read fairy tales, I fancied that kind of thing never happened, and now here I am in the middle of one. There ought to be a book written about me, that there ought, and when I grow up, I'll write one. But I'm grown up now." At least there's no room to grow up in anymore here. Okay, so it's talking about her transition into growing into something else. And of course, I'm using this to mirror our transition into something else, which is this tale, and then later Harry Potter. Okay, chapter 5. So this is on my page 46. We get another reminder that Alice will change and is actually changing right before our eyes. But as you know, change is something that happens gradually. It's something that happens slowly, and she builds to change. Now, this is one of my favorite chapters. Advice from a Caterpillar is the title. And I love this idea of her getting advice from a caterpillar who is smoking hookah, of course. And so all of the things that are prim and proper just don't fit in this world, meaning that Alice, or at least the old Alice, does not belong here. All of the things that she once cared about are really made to look ridiculous. And this becomes even more clear as she is going through this world. Now, that's in chapter 6, but I want to bring that up now because it comes up too in chapter 5. So we get another reminder that she will change and is changing right before our eyes. On page 46, first page of chapter 5, "This was not an encouraging opening for conversation. The caterpillar asks her, 'Who are you?' And Alice replied rather shyly, I hardly know, sir. I just at present, I think I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then." So that's, foreshadowing the change that is to come. "What do you mean by that?" said the caterpillar sternly. "Explain yourself." And she says, "I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir," said Alice, "because I'm not myself, you see." "I don't see," says the caterpillar, right? So this is her exchanging this conversation, trying to figure out what's what. Now, here's why this is so great. If you hadn't noticed, we see her discussion with a caterpillar, which is in of itself a creature of change, right? A creature destined to change. He will surely become a butterfly, and Alice belabors this point to him. And so we see this conversation with the caterpillar being really tense, and he's being very contradictory to her. And it's fitting that she's having this discussion with him. On page 52, Alice said nothing. She had never been so much contradicted in her life before, and she felt that she was losing her temper, right? Because she's never been challenged before. And that's something that Wonderland is doing for her. It's challenging her to think in a way that she never thought before, to become something she's never been before. And then we see that she turns into a serpent on page 55. Now this is great. She meets the caterpillar, right, who's serpent-like, but the serpent is, much longer, much more carnivorous. And so we see the serpent, and then there's a significance here. So the serpent in ancient times actually represented an agent of change. It represented much like what the bird represents to us now, which is something ethereal, which is a higher spiritual being that can move between two worlds, sky and land. The serpent used to represent this as well, becoming new from one's old self, kind of like similar to the way we think about a phoenix. And this is because serpents shed their skin, right? I think every 7 years, I believe, or something like that, something to that effect. Don't quote me on that. But serpents shed their skin, and in doing that, they create kind of this circular, this everlasting circle of death and life. And so we get that same symbol here, and that's what we're seeing is going to be possible for Alice. After the serpent, then we meet another serpent-like symbol, and that symbol is the pigeon that beats Alice with its wings when Alice is the serpent. And so Alice herself, she has become the serpent, right? And she doesn't realize that she's a serpent until the pigeon starts beating her with its wings. And calls her a serpent. And she says, I'm not a serpent. But see, this represents rebirth. The same thing is true for Alice. Yeah, good things here. I was going to make a mention about Egyptian mythology, but we'll get there. We'll get there later. Okay, chapter 6. So I made this point before, so I won't really touch on it again, but we start to see stuff being made fun of that would be typical for Alice to see. So in chapter 6, we see a fish footman, right, delivering an invitation to the Duchess. So that's in the first 2 pages of chapter 6, and we see that. For the first time, we get the threat of cutting off Alice's head. That happens on page 63. The Cheshire Cat appears, who reappears and disappears as well. On page 63, tacking of axes, said the Duchess, chop off her head, right? We know that we're going to hear that again from the Red Queen that Alice is destined to meet. I think that for Alice, the White Rabbit barely speaks to her, but leads her to this world. The Cheshire Cat is the one who gives her advice. Everyone else gives her a hard time, but the Cheshire Cat, even though he kind of speaks in riddles as well, he's the closest guide I think that she gets in this entire world. And that brings us to chapter 7. So in chapter 7, we see a little bit more equivocation and circular reasoning on pages 73 and 74. She goes on with the Mad Hatter and the March Hare. So you can even remember from the Disney movies how those conversations go. They go around in circles, and that's an example of that. That's chapter 7, her meeting those characters. Those could be additional guides for her as well. Now, let's look at chapter 8. When we meet the Queen for the first time, this is the croquet, right? Everyone's showing up for the croquet game. She meets the Queen for the first time, and then she learns that she has an affinity for the color red. Whoops, little typo there. An affinity for the color red. This is what I get for reading and typing at the same time. What significance is this to Alice? So you know this answer. I won't even say this answer because we've talked about this color so much. When we talk about color theory and we talk about symbolism in literature, you know as well as I do all the things that color mean, all the things that the color red can mean. And they're even painting the roses red in the beginning when she first arrives on the court. So I won't even get into that. We do see more equivocation and circular reasoning on pages 94 and 95 as well. And there's nonsense being taught. And I love this scene because we see the Cheshire Cat appear and then he disappears and the only thing that we can see is his head. And the king and queen want him beheaded. And they argue anything that has a head could be beheaded and that you were not to talk nonsense. And they're saying, well, how can I cut his head if the head is the only thing that exists? And so the queen's argument was that if something wasn't done about it in less than no time, then she'd have everybody executed all around, because we know the Red Queen is mad. It was this last remark that had made the whole party look so grave and anxious. So I just love it when the queen comes on the scene because she really changes the dynamic of all the characters. Okay, chapter 9. We get a hint that as much nonsense as the story contains, it might actually leave a message and a purpose in Alice's mind. And I love, love, love this. For me, this is on page 98 when she's talking to the Duchess. Now, this is the same Duchess that she encountered before when she saw the frog footman delivering the invitation to the Queen's event. And so she says on page 98, "Tut, tut, child, everything's got a moral, if only you can find it." And she squeezed herself up closer to Alice's side as she spoke. And so she tries to find a meaning in everything. She tries to find a moral in everything, even though the morals and the lessons that she recites really don't make sense. But this is important for Alice, and this kind of sticks with her near the end. So that's chapter 9. Chapter 10, Alice gets yet another guide to see her through this world. And that happens upon introduction to the Griffin from the Queen. And so she introduces her to the Griffin, which takes her on to hear the Mock Turtle's sad story. And so we see that happening there. Page number 124. Well, I'll leave this for you to discover. But in chapter 10, she meets another guide. I won't tell you who it is because this is part of your short answer response. So you have to read in order to figure that out. Chapter 11, we see that idle threats are issued to execute those on the stand. What is the meaning of this? I think this is really just to show how much meaning words can really have and how little meaning they have if you just use them nonsensically. We see on page 24 that the Hatter is called to the stand in the Red Queen's court to give evidence. And the king says, "Give your evidence and don't be nervous or I'll have you executed on the spot." And then on page 125, "Give your evidence," the king repeated angrily, "or I'll have you executed whether you're nervous or not." Okay, so we kind of see all these idle threats about people being beheaded, people being executed. It gets you to thinking about the meaning of the words and why they do this when they know that everyone's going to be pardoned anyway, which is what we see happening in this chapter and the next. Why does Alice begin growing again back to her normal size on page 124 and 125? This is important. So at the bottom of page 124, the Dormouse says, "I wish you wouldn't squeeze so," because she's sitting next to the Dormouse from the Mad Hatter, and he was sitting next to her. "I can hardly breathe." "I can't help it," Alice said very meekly. "I'm growing." "You have no right to grow here," said the Dormouse. "Don't talk nonsense," said Alice more boldly. "You know you're growing too." "Yes, but I grow at a reasonable pace," said the Dormouse. "Not in that ridiculous fashion." And he got up very sulkily and crossed over to the other side of the court. So Alice is continuing